First story, the last stop. I'd always been known around town as the bus driver who never missed a beat. For over 30 years, I drove the same late-night route along the back roads of our small county in upstate New York. When I retired, I thought I'd enjoy the peace, but the truth was I missed those quiet nights, the empty roads, and the way the headlights sliced through the mist like a knife. That's why, one chilly November night, I decided to drive out along my old route. The town had grown over the years, but my old stretch of road, winding through forest and farmland, still looked the same, just as lonely and dark as ever. I'd only been on the road a few miles when I saw it. Out there on that dirt road, tucked halfway into the forest, was an old yellow school bus. It was strange because our town had updated the school buses recently, and I knew every model by heart. But this one was ancient, maybe from the 70s or earlier, faded and rusty, with tall windows and a dented body. Curiosity got the best of me. I parked my truck at the side of the road, grabbed my flashlight, and approached the bus. The door hung slightly open, creaking in the wind, almost like it was inviting me in. As soon as I stepped inside, an overwhelming smell hit me. A strange mix of mildew and something metallic, like old pennies. The seats were torn, faded, and covered in streaks of mud. I ran my hand over one of them, pulling it back quickly when I noticed streaks of small, dirty handprints smeared across the seats. Some so small they looked like they'd been left by children. The air grew heavy, suffocating, like the entire bus was holding its breath. I shone my flashlight towards the back, and that's when I saw it. At first, it looked like a shadow pressed against the back seat, but as I squinted, I realized it was a person. A tall, thin figure, sitting deathly still, as if it had been waiting there for a very, very long time. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of its head, slightly tilted, as though it was watching me. "Hello!" I called out, though my voice sounded small in the silence. The figure didn't move. A wave of dread washed over me, urging me to turn and leave, but my feet stayed planted. I felt like a child again, frozen by some primal fear. The figure in the back remained silent, yet it seemed to be aware of me, watching. I forced myself to move, to leave, but just as I turned towards the door, I heard it, a soft scrape, like fingernails dragging down a window. I looked around, and there it was again. Scratches on the windows, deep grooves that ran in chaotic patterns along the glass. And then, I swear, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, a flash of something pale against the window. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut, making me jump. I stumbled, my heart pounding, and rushed to the front of the bus, yanking at the door handle. It wouldn't budge. I banged against the glass, yelling, but the silence outside swallowed my voice whole. Then, out of nowhere, I felt the floor beneath me shudder as the engine sputtered to life. I stumbled back, watching in disbelief as the gauges on the dashboard flickered and the headlights blinked on, casting a weak, yellowish glow over the trees outside. The gearshift moved on its own, and before I could react, the bus began to roll forward, the wheels crunching slowly over gravel and dirt. "Stop!" I shouted, grasping at the wheel, trying to regain control. But it was as if the bus had a mind of its own, dragging us further and further down the road, away from anything remotely familiar. I could feel every bump, every rock, the old engine groaning with each turn. And then, from the back of the bus, I heard a faint, raspy whisper. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it getting closer, inching its way towards me, the air growing colder and colder. The whisper grew louder, a soft murmur that slipped into my ears, saying something that felt like my name, or maybe something worse. I slammed my fists against the windows, the doors, anything, but the bus kept moving deeper into the forest, where the trees seemed to twist and bend towards us, as if they were reaching out. My vision blurred, and for a second, it felt like I was sinking, drowning in that old metallic smell, in the cold, in the darkness. I don't remember much after that, only that the bus finally stopped. The air inside was still, and that oppressive weight seemed to vanish. I could hear the wind again, rustling the leaves outside. I was too afraid to turn around, too afraid to see if the figure was still there. So I just closed my eyes, hoping it would all end. The next thing I remember is nothing. The next morning, a park ranger found the bus abandoned by the roadside. There was no sign of me, just my uniform folded neatly on the back seat. Second story, the leaf collector. Living alone in Vermont had always suited me. I preferred the quiet, the way the hills rolled into the forests, and how fall wrapped the land in rich hues of red, yellow, and burnt orange. Since childhood, autumn had been my season, and leaf collecting had become my small, treasured ritual. Every year, I'd walk through the woods around my property, selecting the most perfect fallen leaves I could find, pressing them and arranging them meticulously into albums. This past year, I had my albums neatly organized and nearly full when November rolled around. By then, most of the trees were bare, their leaves scattered across the ground or whisked away by the wind. I closed up my collection for the season, feeling that quiet satisfaction that only solitude and a finished project can bring. But then, early one morning, I stepped outside and saw it. A single leaf, perfectly formed, lying on the welcome mat by my door. It was a deep, blood-red maple leaf, pressed and dry as though it had been perfectly preserved. Odd, I thought, but dismissed it, assuming the wind had blown it there. I brought it inside, wondering if maybe the season wasn't quite over. The next morning, there were 3 leaves: a golden beech, a scarlet oak, and a deep purple ash leaf, as though carefully selected and placed on my mat. By the 3rd morning, there were 6, each one uniquely shaped, preserved, and unlike any I'd collected before. I was intrigued, a little unnerved, but a part of me wondered if someone had noticed my hobby and decided to play along. I couldn't help but be curious about where these leaves were coming from, so I grabbed my coat and took a walk through the woods. The trees stood silent and bare, their branches stark against the gray November sky. The ground was littered with brittle, fading leaves, none as vibrant as the ones on my mat. I walked further, drawn to a secluded part of the forest I rarely visited, and that's when I saw it. A lone tree standing tall, despite being long dead, its twisted trunk dry and hollow, covered in a dark, strange symbol carved deeply into the bark. I ran my fingers over the carving, which was intricate, almost like an ancient rune, though I didn't recognize it. The bark around the symbol was rough and dry, with bits of brittle leaves caught in its cracks. Something about that tree felt wrong, and a deep chill settled over me as I backed away, hurrying home, eager to put distance between myself and that strange, dead tree. That night, I tried to ignore the gnawing feeling that I wasn't alone. I double-checked the locks, drew the curtains, and climbed into bed, hoping for sleep to take me away from my anxious thoughts. But the silence of the night was broken by a faint, rustling sound outside my window, like dry leaves brushing against one another, too constant and too close to be the wind. I lay there, listening, my heart pounding as the sound grew louder, until it felt as though something was right outside my bedroom window, scratching softly at the glass. Morning brought relief, but my nerves were frayed. Stepping outside, I found the welcome mat covered in leaves, dozens of them vibrant, perfectly pressed, forming a twisted pattern that trailed down my steps and onto the ground. It was as if something or someone had been here while I slept, arranging them with a sick, meticulous care. I couldn't stand it any longer. That night, armed with a box of matches, I walked back to the dead tree. The symbol seemed to glare back at me in the fading light, as if daring me to do what I'd come to do. I struck a match, holding it to the dry bark until it caught, watching as flames quickly engulfed the hollow trunk. I felt a wave of relief as the fire burned higher, casting strange shadows across the forest, swallowing the symbol in its flames. But that night, something changed. As soon as I returned to the house, I felt watched. An unnatural silence fell over the woods, broken only by the faintest whispering rustle. Then, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it again. Footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, dragging across the leaf-strewn ground. I got out of bed, heart hammering, and peeked out the window. My blood ran cold. Figures were standing in my yard, shadows that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Their bodies made from twisted branches and leaves, dry and brittle, shifting and crackling in the wind. They didn't have faces, just hollow indentations where eyes should have been, staring unblinkingly at my house. I backed away, terrified, as more of them appeared, moving forward in jerky, stilted motions, surrounding the house until there was nowhere left to run. The whispers filled the air, a low, menacing hum as if the very leaves were speaking. Their words a language I couldn't understand but somehow knew was meant for me. I stumbled backward, clutching the walls, desperately trying to ignore the sound of branches scraping against my door. The dry, crackling laughter that echoed through the house as I closed my eyes and waited for morning to come. But when dawn broke, all that was left of me were ashes and burned leaves scattered across the front steps of my home. And in the quiet town of Yellow Oaks, there's a new tree on the edge of the forest, its bark scarred by a strange symbol, and its branches covered in leaves that never fade, waiting for the next one to come. Third story, the photo no one took. Photography had always been a hobby for me, a way to capture little details that most people missed. So, when I stumbled upon an old camera at an antiques fair, I thought it would be perfect for a vintage photo project I'd been wanting to start. It was a sturdy, classic model from the 1950s, with a heavy metal body and a beautiful etched logo. The vendor didn't say much about it other than that it had belonged to a professional photographer back in the day, which only added to the allure. That evening, I took it out for a test run around my neighborhood. The feel of the camera was satisfying, grounding somehow. I clicked through a series of shots. An old mailbox, a street lamp casting an eerie glow on the sidewalk, a shadowy alley. Nothing special, but I wanted to see how it would capture moody, vintage-looking scenes. The entire process felt right, like the camera and I were perfectly synced. But things got strange when I went to develop the film. In the darkroom, as the first images began to take shape, I noticed something odd. Among the shots I remembered taking, there were a few others I hadn't seen through the viewfinder. In one frame, the mailbox was there, but so was a figure standing right beside it. The person's face was obscured, and their posture looked unnatural, as if their limbs were bent at impossible angles. I blinked, trying to remember if anyone had been around while I was shooting, but I was certain I'd been alone. The next shot was even stranger. The alley I'd photographed was there, but a man's silhouette was slouched against the wall. His face was out of focus, distorted, and there was something hollow in the way he stood. His arms dangled loosely at his sides, his head cocked at a disturbing angle, almost like he was waiting. Each new photo revealed another ghostly presence. A blurred hand reaching out from the edge of the frame, a dark shape in the background of an otherwise empty street. None of these were images I'd taken, and none of them matched my memory of that quiet evening. I convinced myself I'd just made some error, some trick of double exposure or film degradation, though I couldn't explain why only some images were affected. But even that didn't make sense. The faces in the photos were unlike anything I'd ever seen, stretched and smudged, like they didn't quite belong in our world. Intrigued and slightly unsettled, I decided to look into the camera's history, thinking maybe it would explain these oddities. A few days later, after scouring online forums and historical archives, I found a lead. The camera had once belonged to a photographer named Martin Harlan. According to the article, Harlan was a promising artist who specialized in surreal, haunting scenes. He died in a car crash on a foggy November night in 1956. Witnesses claimed that he'd been driving erratically, as though he'd been distracted or afraid. His last project, which he was working on at the time of his death, was never found, though there were rumors it had been meant to capture images that live beyond the moment. By then, I was sufficiently spooked, but rather than returning the camera or hiding it away, I felt drawn to it. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, maybe I felt compelled to finish what Harlan had started. I'm still not sure, but something in me needed to take it out again to see if those figures would appear in my photos again. So, one more time, I brought it out into the quiet streets, waiting for dusk. That night, every time I raised the camera, a chill ran down my spine. The air felt heavy, electric, as though something were pressing down around me, waiting. I snapped shots of empty sidewalks, street corners, dimly lit alleys. But each time I looked through the lens, it felt wrong, like I wasn't alone. When I went to develop the film, my hands shook. The darkroom felt colder than usual, and as I watched the images come to life on the paper, my breath caught. Figures, again vague, distorted shapes peering from the corners, some closer than they had been before. One image showed a pair of hands reaching toward the lens, like someone trying to pull me in. By now, I knew I needed to get rid of the camera. It felt like a portal to something dark, something beyond my control. I decided I'd destroy it, take a hammer to it, and bury the pieces if I had to. But just as I picked it up to carry it outside, my phone rang, the screen flashing, unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something compelled me to. I lifted the phone to my ear, and there was silence on the other end. Then, after a long pause, I heard a voice, barely more than a whisper. "Kevin." My blood went cold. The voice sounded like my own, twisted and warped as though coming from a distance. "Take one more photo." The line went dead, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Despite every instinct telling me to leave, to run, I raised the camera and looked through the viewfinder. The room around me appeared dark and distorted, almost like I was seeing it from another dimension. And then I saw myself. But it wasn't me. The figure in the viewfinder was hunched, its face blurred and hollow, the mouth stretched open in a silent scream. Its hands were reaching out toward me from the frame, twisted and wrong. I dropped the camera, my heart pounding, and stumbled out of the room. But that night, I couldn't escape the image. The figure haunted my dreams, that hollow face and those outstretched hands reaching for me in the darkness. The next morning, a friend found me in my room, clutching the camera with empty eyes, staring at the wall as if still looking through the lens. They said I couldn't speak, that I was frozen in shock. I don't remember any of it. All I know is I can still see that last image every time I close my eyes. That camera took something from me, something I'll never get back. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I still hear it calling my name, asking for one more photo. Fourth story, The Stranger in the Window. When I moved into the historic house on Habersham Street in Savannah, Georgia, I was expecting a fresh start. November brought a cool breeze through the Spanish moss hanging from the oaks, and the house itself was beautiful. An old, creaking Victorian that oozed charm and history. It was more than I'd expected to afford, but the agent assured me it was a unique find. I thought she was referring to its preserved architecture and the price, but it didn't take long to realize she might have meant something else. The first night was unsettling. As I unpacked, I heard the wind rattling the window in the guest bedroom down the hall. I assumed it was loose, so I went in to latch it securely. The room was quiet and still, and I fastened the window shut, thinking nothing more of it. But at exactly 2 a.m., the sound of the window creaking open echoed through the house. I jolted awake, my heart racing. I hurried to the guest room and found the window slid halfway up, letting the cold night air spill in. I shut it tightly and checked to see if the latch was broken. It looked fine. Just an old house with quirks, I told myself. The next night, it happened again, 2 a.m. sharp. I heard the window slide open, that distinct creaking sound that seemed almost purposeful. Again, I got up, latched it, and returned to bed, feeling a chill that wasn't from the cold. By the third night, I was on edge, anticipating the sound. When it came, I lay still, listening. This time, though, I felt a pull to see what might be out there. So I tiptoed down the hall, stopping just outside the guest room door, my hand hesitating on the knob. I took a deep breath and pushed it open just enough to peer through the crack. The window was open again, but this time I wasn't alone. Standing on the sidewalk outside, barely visible under the dim glow of the street lamp, was a man. He wore an old-fashioned coat, dark and heavy, and his face was turned up, looking directly at the window. Directly at me. My heart stopped. He was utterly still, his posture unnervingly stiff, as though he'd been standing there waiting for hours. I held my breath, not daring to move, my mind racing. I closed the window carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible, and locked it firmly. But when I peeked back through the glass, he hadn't moved an inch. He was still there, looking up with eyes that seemed too dark to reflect any light. The next day, I tried to reason with myself. I was tired, probably imagining things. It was an old neighborhood, and maybe he was a neighbor or a passerby. I even asked a woman from the house next door if she'd seen anyone hanging around. She just looked at me strangely and shook her head, telling me the neighborhood was usually very quiet at night. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my ears tuned for the faintest sound. And then, like clockwork, the window creaked open at 2 a.m. I sat up, my pulse thudding. This time, I decided I couldn't just stay hidden. I had to see if he was really there, and if he was, well, I'd confront him. Heart pounding, I moved to the guest room, keeping my footsteps light, and pulled back the curtain. There he was, standing in the exact same spot, his face blank and his gaze piercing right through the window at me. But this time, something was different. He wasn't on the sidewalk anymore. He was closer, just at the edge of the yard, his face still unreadable, his eyes dark pools that seemed to hold something unnatural. I slammed the window shut and locked it, trying to shake the feeling that his gaze had followed me back down the hall. I hardly slept, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house, my mind tangled in fear and confusion. The next night, I was determined to end this once and for all. I'd confront him outside, face to face, and demand to know what he wanted. At 1:50 a.m., I slipped on my coat, braced myself, and waited by the front door. When the clock hit 2 a.m., I stepped outside, walking to the sidewalk with a bravado I didn't truly feel. But when I looked up at the guest room window, my blood ran cold. There, behind the glass, was a figure. It was me, my exact reflection, staring down at me from inside the house. She wore my clothes, had my same fearful expression, but the eyes looking back at me weren't mine. They held something dark, something that shouldn't have been possible. My mouth opened in a silent scream, but the reflection didn't move, its gaze fixed on me like a predator sizing up its prey. Shaking, I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the curb as I dashed back into the house. I burst through the door, calling out, but the rooms were silent, eerily empty. When I ran back to the guest room, the window was shut, locked tight, and there was no one in the house. The next morning, the neighbors said they saw someone standing in the window of the guest room overnight. A figure staring out onto the street, watching, waiting. But they couldn't have. I wasn't there. No one has seen me since. But every night, when the clock strikes 2 a.m., the window in the guest room creaks open, and a figure stands behind the glass, looking out at the world with eyes that are no longer mine. Fifth story, the Thanksgiving Eve game. Every Thanksgiving Eve since we were 12, my friends and I had a tradition. Right before the holiday, we'd go to the dense, twisted woods behind my family's place in rural Maine to play hide and seek. It wasn't like we hadn't heard stories of people getting lost in those woods. But for us, it was a ritual. There was something about the game, the crisp November air, the quiet darkness, and the thrill of hiding with only the sound of the dead leaves crunching underfoot. But last year, something changed, and I still can't shake it. It was me, Tyler, Jake, and Emma that night. The rules were simple. Hide, stay quiet, and, if you're found, join in to help find everyone else. The person found last one, which gave us each a strange thrill every year, trying to be the one who couldn't be caught. We started after dark, the thick trees casting long shadows, with only our flashlights and the moon lighting the way. We counted down from the old tree stump by the house, our base. Tyler volunteered to be the seeker. I remember him laughing as he covered his eyes and counted slowly. 1, 2, 3. Emma and Jake went in one direction, and I headed deeper, finding a thick cluster of trees just at the edge of a small clearing. The game had started. I crouched low, waiting. I could hear Tyler moving through the forest in the distance, calling out, his voice echoing through the stillness. Ready or not, here I come. It was only a matter of time before he'd find one of us, and the anticipation always sent a chill down my spine. After about 10 minutes, I started hearing footsteps crunching through the dry leaves, slow and deliberate. They were too close to be Tyler's. He'd been farther out a second ago. I held my breath, ready to be found, but the footsteps passed me by without a pause, heading deeper into the woods. I figured it was Jake or Emma, but then the footsteps stopped completely. Silence settled over the forest, thick and unnerving. Then came the whisper. It was so close that I could have sworn it was right beside me, a low, faint sound just above the wind's rustle. I strained my ears, trying to make out the words, but all I could catch were fragments, a barely their voice mumbling something just beyond comprehension. I held my breath, straining to listen, hoping it was just one of my friends playing a prank. But then I heard a sharp crack, like a twig snapping, and something moved just out of my line of sight. My flashlight flickered on as I stood, calling out, Jake? Emma? This isn't funny. No one answered. The whisper stopped. For a moment, I felt completely alone, the silence closing in. But then I heard Tyler's voice in the distance, calling out for Jake. Relieved, I followed his voice, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching me. When I finally reached Tyler, I noticed his uneasy expression. Emma was with him, her face pale and tense. Have you seen Jake? Tyler asked, sounding more serious than usual. No, but I heard something, I replied, trying not to sound rattled. We all heard it, Emma said quietly, glancing over her shoulder toward the trees. Voices, like someone was whispering. The three of us shared a look. I could tell we all felt it, that sense that something in the woods wasn't right. Tyler suggested we head back, maybe check the house to see if Jake had circled back on his own. Just as we turned to leave, we heard it again. A soft, breathy whisper, close enough to make my skin crawl. Then, the footsteps returned, louder this time, like someone was moving fast through the underbrush, weaving between trees with a speed and purpose that didn't match any of us. Emma gasped, and Tyler cursed under his breath as we moved faster, nearly breaking into a run. But just as we reached the edge of the clearing, the whispers grew louder, converging around us. They sounded urgent, a muddled mix of words and voices, like people were mumbling from all directions, and one word stood out, chilling me to the bone. Stay. I turned my flashlight to where the voices were strongest, expecting to find Jake playing some twisted prank. But instead, there was only darkness, an empty space where no one stood. We bolted back to the house, the whispers fading as we reached the edge of the forest. Inside, we huddled together, shaken. Jake hadn't returned, and his phone went straight to voicemail every time we tried. We convinced ourselves it was just some prank he'd gone overboard with, that he'd be back by morning with some elaborate story. But when dawn came, and Jake still hadn't shown, we called his parents. The police came, searched the woods for hours, but found nothing. We returned to town, trying to let it go, but the worry ate at us. Then, a few days later, we all received the same text. I'm waiting to be found. It was from Jake's number, but when we replied, there was no answer. The police tracked the phone, but it was dead. No signal, no trace. Every Thanksgiving Eve since, we each get that same message. Always from Jake's number, always the same haunting words. I'm waiting to be found. This year, I drove by my family's house, looking at those dark woods, knowing that somewhere in there, Jake is still waiting. But I'll never go back there. Not after what we heard, what we saw or didn't see, in the shadows. Sixth story, the November Drifter. They say the Colorado backroads hold strange secrets, and I've driven long enough to know there's some truth to it. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that icy November night. I'd been assigned a long-haul route across Colorado, cutting through a deserted stretch of mountain road that wound through steep cliffs and sharp turns. I'd driven the route a few times in summer, but I knew November was different. Brutal wind, black ice, and a mist that hung thick in the valleys like it was hiding something. It was nearing midnight as I climbed into the higher elevations, the cold seeping through the cab despite the heater running full blast. Then, somewhere on that narrow road, I saw him, a man standing at the edge of the asphalt. At first, he looked like a shadow against the fog, but as my headlights caught him, I could see he was dressed in tattered clothes, a thin jacket hanging off his frame. He raised his arm, a slow, deliberate movement, signaling for me to stop. Every instinct told me to keep going. It was freezing out there, sure, but no trucker in his right mind would stop on this road at this hour. I gripped the wheel, pressed down on the gas, and passed him. As I sped up, I glanced into my rearview mirror, expecting to see him vanish into the mist. But he didn't. There he was, walking right behind my truck, keeping up as if my speed meant nothing. His movements were slow and unnatural, almost as if he were gliding, but he never lost pace. My heart pounded as I watched him in disbelief, his figure fading in and out of sight with each curve in the road. I pressed harder on the gas, trying to shake him, pushing the truck faster than I should have on that icy road. My headlights cut through the darkness, but the fog was thickening, swallowing the road ahead. Just as I started to believe I'd lost him, I caught another glimpse in the mirror. He was still there, his face hidden under the brim of a ragged hat, but his eyes, dark and empty, seemed to lock with mine through the glass. Then the banging started. At first, it was faint, like something shifting in the cargo. I convinced myself it was just the road rattling the load, but the sound grew louder, sharper, persistent, like fists pounding on the inside of the trailer walls. I tightened my grip, forcing myself to ignore it, but each bang felt like it was hitting me straight in the chest. Whatever was back there was getting desperate. By now, the temperature in the cab had dropped, my breath fogging up the glass. I couldn't ignore the noise any longer. It was so loud it seemed to echo through the mountains. I slowed down, my mind racing, unsure what I'd do once I stopped. But that's when I saw the lights, a faint glow cutting through the fog, just ahead. A rest stop. I pulled in, parking near the ghostly, half-collapsed station. I turned off the engine, leaving the headlights on, and climbed out, the cold night air biting through my jacket. The banging from the trailer hadn't stopped, and now it felt closer, like something was clawing its way out. My hand shook as I unlocked the trailer and threw the doors open. Inside was empty, except for an old, tattered jacket lying in the center of the floor. The fabric was stained, caked with dried mud, like it had been buried for years. I recognized the style immediately. It was a trucker's jacket, the kind they used to wear back in the 70s. But this one was faded and frayed, with a name patch barely legible. Earl. I took a step back, heart hammering, every instinct screaming at me to get out. As I turned to close the trailer, something caught my eye in the cab. The man was there, sitting in the passenger seat, his face in shadow but unmistakable. He was looking straight ahead, completely still, as if he belonged there. My throat tightened, and I froze, watching him in disbelief. His clothes were old, layered with grime, like he'd walked out of another time. And then, just for a second, his eyes flicked toward me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I stumbled backward, slamming the trailer doors shut. I scrambled into the cab through the driver's side, hands shaking so bad I could barely grip the wheel, but the seat next to me was empty. Only the faintest trace of mud lay on the floor mat, and a freezing chill lingered in the air. I slammed the truck into gear and tore out of the rest stop, the tires skidding on the icy road. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The banging had stopped, but the silence was worse, thick with the presence that now felt too close. I drove through the night, every mile stretching longer than the last, the fog never lifting. When dawn finally broke, I found myself in a small town. I pulled into a diner parking lot, my nerves shot, and sat there for a long time, trying to shake the image of that man from my mind. Eventually, I got out, still feeling the cold clinging to my skin, and went inside to make a call. That's when the server behind the counter looked up at me, her face pale as I mentioned the route I'd taken. She shook her head slowly, almost like she'd heard it all before. "You saw him, didn't you, Earl? Disappeared back in '78 on that same stretch. Never found his body, but folks say he walks those roads every November, trying to find his way back." I didn't answer, couldn't. I just stumbled out of the diner, my hands trembling, the faint memory of his eyes lingering in my mind. And when I climbed back into the truck, that old jacket was waiting for me, lying neatly on the passenger seat, as if it had always been there. I haven't taken that route since, and every year, when November rolls around, I still feel his eyes on me, watching from somewhere on that road, waiting for someone foolish enough to let him in. Seventh story, the voice in the hallway. I moved into the old house on the outskirts of Boston in late October. It was one of those grand, creaky, three-story homes, with high ceilings and narrow hallways that seemed to stretch into shadows even in the daylight. At first, the house's quirks felt charming, the kind of place where every sound and drafty corner seemed steeped in history. For the first few weeks, it was peaceful, though I'd sometimes hear creaks and groans from the floors and walls, just the house settling, or so I thought. But then, a week after Halloween, I began hearing something else. It always started around midnight, right as I was drifting off to sleep. A single footstep, then another, sounding softly in the hallway just outside my bedroom door. I told myself it was nothing, just the house's way of stretching as it cooled for the night. But each night, the footsteps grew clearer, more deliberate, as though someone were pacing back and forth, up and down the narrow hallway. Then came the whispering. At first, it was so faint I could hardly tell if I was actually hearing it or if it was some strange trick of my half-asleep mind. But one night, I woke with a start and heard it clearly, a muffled, low murmur just beyond my door, as though someone were pressing their mouth close to the wood, calling my name. "Claire." My heart pounded. I lay still, every muscle tensed, too afraid to open the door and look. The voice stopped as suddenly as it started, and the silence that followed felt heavy, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The next morning, I convinced myself it had to be a dream, but the footsteps and the voice returned the next night and the next. It became almost a routine, a slow, torturous buildup just after midnight. First, the footsteps, then the faint, chilling murmur of my name. The more I tried to ignore it, the louder it became, as though the house itself was demanding my attention. After a week of sleepless nights, I decided to set up a camera in the hallway. I needed proof that it was just my imagination, some strange auditory hallucination. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and I told myself that seeing an empty hallway would put my mind at ease. The next morning, with a pounding heart, I reviewed the footage. The recording was grainy, with only the dim glow of the hallway's single light illuminating the scene. At first, there was nothing, just the empty, silent corridor. But then, around 12:15 a.m., a dark shadow appeared at the end of the hallway. My stomach turned as I watched, unable to look away. The shadow was humanoid, standing at the far end of the hall, facing my bedroom door. It didn't move, didn't shift, just stood there, its form hazy and indistinct, as though it were part of the darkness itself. It lingered for minutes, standing perfectly still, before slowly fading back into the shadows. My hands were trembling. I played the footage again, hoping to see something that would explain it away. But each time, the shadow stood there, immobile, watching my door. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every creak and whisper, too terrified to leave my room. Over the next few days, I tried to rationalize it, to find some explanation. In desperation, I started looking up the history of the house. After hours of digging, I found a small article from the 1930s about a man named Harold Finch, the previous owner. He had lived alone in the house and had been reported missing in early November. No one ever saw him again. He simply vanished without a trace. The case went cold. The house was eventually sold, and his disappearance faded into the town's history. It was November now, I realized, the same month he had disappeared. I felt a chill, an instinctual urge to leave the house. That night, after hearing my name whispered in that hollow, echoing voice, I decided I'd had enough. I packed a bag and made for the front door, determined to leave, even if it meant staying at a hotel. But when I opened the door, the hallway was dark, pitch black in a way it had never been before. I fumbled for the light switch, but the lights wouldn't come on. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I heard the footsteps again, closer this time, as though they were right behind me. I turned, shining my phone's flashlight, but the beam showed nothing but shadows, stretching deeper into the hall. With my heart racing, I stepped forward, calling out, "Who's there?" But my voice was swallowed by the silence. The footsteps started again, but this time, they were right beside me, as though an invisible presence was pacing in perfect step. I took a shaky breath and moved toward my room. But as I looked back, the darkness felt denser, as though something was lurking just at the edge of my vision. Just as I reached my bedroom, the lights flickered back on, casting a dim glow across the hallway. I could see nothing unusual, just the empty corridor and the cracked, worn paint on the walls. My hand trembled as I closed the door, too afraid to turn off the lights. The footsteps faded, and I slumped against the wall, too afraid to close my eyes. The next morning, I found the camera still recording. I replayed the footage, hoping for some rational answer. But all it showed was the hallway, empty and silent, with my bedroom door slightly ajar. There was no sign of me, no sign of movement, just that empty, shadowed hall. I left that morning. I don't know what I experienced, if it was a trick of my mind or something that the house held on to from the past. But every November, I find myself wondering about the hallway and whether something or someone is still waiting, whispering my name in the dead of night.